Wendy here, and I'm just going to try. I guess this is the third week in a row that I've done this, where I've done a video podcast, a video recording on the same day that my podcast dropped. And the idea would be to do a short summary of both the newsletter and podcast, Wild and Precious Conversations, and see if I can meld the two. This week's theme was imagination for the newsletter, and the podcast conversation was thrivability. So, to put it into context, my conversation on thrivability was with Jean Russell, and we were discussing the book, The Dawn of Everything. The newsletter theme, imagination, was sort of the idea of imagination juxtaposed against the idea of fantasy, and really took its essence from the book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, which I'm still enthralled with, and I guess I'm about 2/3 finished now. So Ian McGilchrist's words on imagination really gripped me, and I'm listening to the audiobook, so I bookmarked sections that I was taken by, but for the newsletter, I just didn't have time to go back and find them in the audiobook. But I found, and this is the next person that I want to mention, I found a person named Jenny Mackness. God, I love her name somehow so much. Jenny Mackness. She is retired now, but has a blog that is well worth reading. And her words on Ian McGilchrist are the perfect summary, I believe, of what sort of, well, I was about to say Cliff's Notes, but they're so much better than Cliff's Notes. And I used her paraphrasing of what he said about imagination versus fantasy in the newsletter. And I think for this week, I'm going to just suggest you please subscribe to the newsletter. It's delightful to get all the sort of gritty details about what I was talking about with regards to that. The basic idea, though, is that we, as humans, have this wonderful capacity, imagination. And that imagination sort of keeps us spiraling ever outward into habitat, a life that is really more suited for us. And what is interesting sometimes is how we get confused, I think, between the idea of fantasy, which is just sort of decoupled from reality, and a wonderful place to go to sometimes. And I would also couple in with that is numbing, that idea of just like shutting down and gambling, having your beer, going shopping, whatever we do in this life to sort of escape this life. Imagination's different. You'll recognize it because it's challenging and difficult, and you sort of sometimes won't want to stay there. What I ended up doing for this week is I actually wrote a blog post to follow up from the newsletter, and I think I'll just share a little bit of that with you now if I can not totally just read from it. What I had found myself doing, though, was in a very difficult way turning toward imagination in the middle of my week last week, when things just so challenging, just so difficult, and I didn't really like where I was. It was reminding me a little bit of the process that I've gone through throughout this project, whatever it's becoming. Because it was sort of a place where I realized I really was at a crossroads. I could either sit here in this world as I know it, that kind of sucks, and I suppose at that point, go off into sort of fantasy or numbing, or I could make a genuine effort to create a world that doesn't suck so much. Now, here I take a little bit of credence from a wonderful saint, Saint Therese, who was considered little flower. And I've always struggled with the idea that she was this little flower because how perfectly, there's so much in that that feels condescending, almost patriarchal, maybe. And I'm sorry if that offends people. It touched on that for me, but very condescending, very like, oh, good, she knew her place, don't get uppity, Saint Therese. But at the same time, it's always spoken to me because, you know, I'm not Michelle Obama. Who am I? Just some person living in a small town, whatever. And yet I can still make my little imprint. Really little imprint. I can still do my small part. I can still put forward my piece that I feel like is moving us toward a more collaborative world. So anyway, that's where I started. Okay, so I'm looking at my man, I might read some of this, and if I can't do a good job of it, I apologize in advance. And oh, there's a little bit of a glare of the newsletter in the corner of my. This past week, as I contemplated usefulness, which is the one from the week before, which in my whole world still felt ripped apart. Days were spent noticing misunderstandings, inversions. What I thought was being true was actually untrue. And people winning when I felt like they needed to be called out. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, or for their lack of ethics, and people going unnoticed who I felt should be heralded for their morality. That was really my week. And I was feeling defeated. I was feeling defeated. So this is where I come upon Ian McGilchrist's words. What I do is that my child has a cello lesson out in a lovely, a home that's on some land with a beach and woods. It's just beautiful. So I spend my time bundled up listening to the master and his emissary while they're in cello lesson. So I am going to read. Hold on. As I contemplated the idea of imagination, which is, again, rooted in reality, I felt a shift. I realized I've been there before, I've been here before, and it really hurts. And again, this has been the whole spiral of this project as it's taking shape. It's painful at times, but the outcome is actually quite good. The outcome is one of growth. And what I realized was, and I don't know if this suits anybody, if this kind of gels with anyone else's understanding, but when you're going to use your imagination and you find yourself in this sort of pile of compost that's been given to you, you need to make sure that you surround yourself with nurturing peoples, nurturing foods, nurturing things, so that the compost that you're in is actually a compost full of lots of growth and imagination and renewal, and not toxic sludge. This metaphor is absolutely brilliant, by the way. I can use it until the cows come home. I think that's really crucial. And so if you're in a compost, if the world has handed you, if you are in a very difficult, challenging situation, I think it's up to us to some extent to make sure that that compost that we find ourselves in is a nourishing one that's going to lead to growth, and not one that's a toxic sludge that's going to lead to fantasy and numbing and death. But anyway, as soon as I realized that, I really did feel like things were starting to come together. It's like this. It's like what we need to do if we want our orchidness. And again, so look at my previous blog posts on my website for what I mean by our orchidness. It's a theory that was put out, I think, in 2009, and it's very important, I think, that we understand it correctly. The idea is that there's a metaphor for orchidness or dandelionness, and some people say there's a tulipness as well. I have, I think, a very well-written blog post about our orchid. I almost want to go to it now and give you some idea that maybe that'll be for next week. Because the idea is not you're not an orchid person or a dandelion person. It's that each of us have a mix of some orchid qualities in us and some dandelion qualities in us. Dandelion qualities are those wonderful things where we can just grow anywhere. We're not really flappable. We're just fine, And what used to be, then there's some parts of us that are the orchid qualities. These are gene expressions, by the way. This is sort of an easy to understand, lovely metaphor for a type of a gene expression for our behavior. Again, blog post. But our orchid qualities, and some of us have more than others, and all in different types of areas of our behavior. So we might have a very difficult time with our anger impulse, for example, or whatever. Again, look at the blog post. But those expressions, when they used to be termed vulnerable. And the reason orchid works better is because what we have found, not me, but experts, what people have found is that given the right conditions, given the right compost, as it were, given the right environment, these orchid expressions flourish and far surpass, I like to say far surpass, but surpass that of the dandelion expressions. So dandelion expressions are great because anywhere, you drop it anywhere, any environment, any compost, they're going to grow. I think of the perfect dandelion expression as, actually, this is a daisy, not a dandelion, but there's the beginning scene of Joe versus the volcano. There's a little flower, a frail flower trying to grow through a crack in the sidewalk. Well, that's the dandelion expression. It's going to grow anywhere, even if it's surrounded by just this very grimy, horrid environment. But it's never going to flourish, and become this orchid. However, the orchid expressions will just wither and die and get very, very mentally sick in the wrong environment, in the wrong compost. In the right, nourishing compost, however, they flourish. Now, I know if you've ever been to Thailand, orchids grow anywhere and everywhere. And so if you're very literal, that metaphor is going to fall apart fast. But hopefully you can, anyway, I'm being a little silly there. But what I've realized, this project as it's taking shape, is that if we would like our orchidness to flourish, we need to carefully nourish this compost that we find ourselves in. And when we do this, we can use our imaginations to grow through trauma, grow through the shit, the compost that life hands us. And this is getting me so excited for the potential of thriving that we have right in front of us. And I would love to be a small part of that, to be honest. Yeah. I also realized, and this is from a couple weeks ago, I said it here first in the effortless video. But what I realized, and what's always kind of not well with me, is I do want to put my imprint out on the world. I want to do something. There's a drive in me that wants to be like, look at what you can have. And then I always kind of get ashamed because, let's face it, here I am in my homemade, podcast fort, wearing hand-me-down clothes, but I like them. This is me. I don't wear a lot of makeup, whatever. I can't promise you, what every other person tries to promise. I can't promise you richness, hipness, fashion sense, beauty. I can't. None of those things. That's not what I'm after. And that's not what I've found from all my years of tr- living on this earth and learning about mental health and stuff. But what I can say, and I might get a little teary, at the end of at the end is that I am growing into a kind of velveteen rabbit realness. And it's amazing. It's amazing. If you think I can't, maybe there's 5 people in the entire world. And if there are, I would be thrilled to know you. Actually, that's where I'm at. Well, come to think of it, there's hundreds, so there's quite a few people who are along for the ride on the podcast or the newsletter. 150, I don't know, something. And I haven't even really shared it. So I guess I do know that there are a few of you out there who are along for the ride into a velveteen rabbit kind of realness where we're going to lose our fur. We're going to maybe lose an eye. I mean, not a real eye, but an eye. Metaphorical eye. So I'd love to invite you to come along for the ride. Subscribe to the newsletter, the podcast. Check out my handmade website. And welcome.